somebody I'm very excited and happy to have here with us today. Daniel McAdams is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute. He was the Foreign Affairs and Civil Liberties advisor for Ron Paul for over a decade. And you can catch him 4 days a week co-hosting the Ron Paul Liberty Report with Dr. Paul and get his and Dr. Paul's wisdom every day. So if you aren't subscribed to that podcast, pull your phone out again, Ron Paul Liberty Report. Daniel.
Yeah, I like what you said, Michael, by the way, about what you're doing, and I think Mises PAC captured it as well, and this is something that Dr. Paul always says, is that we have to first capture the culture, and then legislature, and then policy, and then everything else will follow, and I think that's an important point to make. And one other remark before I start on what Professor said, kind of interesting and very important, which is that, I mean, we tend to get confused over this past year and a half. But before that, we were dealing with wokeism, we were dealing with cancel culture. And in fact, the Ron Paul Institute had a conference scheduled on cancel culture, saying, shut up, cancel culture and the war on speech. It was canceled because of COVID. So there was a precedent for that. But I do want to thank the Mises Caucus for the invitation. I'm not super excited about politics, but I am excited about what Michael and the caucus are trying to do. I like the fact that they're energetic and fresh, and I really I want to applaud everything that they're about, and I really wish them a lot of luck in what they do. And I also like the title of our little event here, Take Human Action. And maybe it sounds weird, but I was sort of pondering this almost in a spiritual way, because the three words have an interesting relation to each other when you emphasize one or the other. Take human action. It's sort of an action that you're taking. And then you emphasize the word human. Take human action. We're all humans here. And then you think of the word action. Action. We're doing something. So it's very interesting and clever. What I'm going to do today is talk in really two heavy-duty presentations. I'm sure your eyes are glazing over, and it doesn't get any better when we start saying, I'm going to talk about foreign policy, because there's a whoosh, it's all. But I have one goal of what I want to do, and that's to sort of outline how should we approach foreign policy as a political party, as a political body, what have you. What should be a libertarian view of foreign policy? And I'll start by, I'm sure many of you know Tom Luongo, who I think is one of the best writers on finance, on everything. But he was reflecting on the death of antiwar.com founder Justin Raimondo back in 2019. And this is an article that Tom wrote in 2019. And he talked about, of course, he talked about the most important thing that Justin Raimondo taught him. In the 20 years of Raimondo writing, for the most part, 3 days a week, and everyone here knows Raimondo, right? Everyone knows of him and has heard of him. In the 20 years of his writing, 3 columns a week. And this is a simple phrase: foreign policy is just war by other means. And it's a very profound thing that Raimondo put forth. And this isn't a direct quote, but this is a thought that permeated everything that Raimondo wrote. And I will say that Raimondo was my gateway drug to libertarianism, and certainly to anti-interventionism and anti-war. Many of you know, I don't want to bore you with my bio, but I was living at the time in Central Europe, and I was a human rights and election monitor, working in the Balkans a lot. And I discovered this guy writing in this god-awful, this was the thing, okay, you kids are not going to even have heard of this, but it was called Free Republic. This is before even the websites, I think, and it was mostly dominated by conservatives and right-wingers. But here's this Justin Raimondo just coming in and getting pummeled every week by writing anti-war things, and just a light went off in my head, because I realized what he was saying from my own experiences was right. And I came from a different perspective, like Professor did, which is, if we only were doing the right things with the right people, gosh, then we could really affect positive change in these newly emerging democracies. I just don't understand why that Bill Clinton keeps supporting commies. He must be a commie himself. I don't get it. This is just terrible. If we were just supporting the right people, is how I was thinking at the time. And Raimondo helped me, as well as my experience on the ground helped me to realize that it's not whether you support the right people, it's that you're supporting anyone or anything at all. And here's a concrete example that I'll give. I spent a lot of time in Albania, a country that not many of us think about too often, but I've been there probably 30 times. And I spent the entire, there was a coup and a civil war in 1997 in Albania. But the first time I was there was in 1993. They had just had the first democratic elections in 91, replacing the long dictatorship of Enver Hoxha, which was probably one of the purest communist dictatorships on earth. They thought that Stalin was a real slacker, and they went for Mao. So it was it was a paranoid state. So when I first got there in 93, things were just starting to open up. And it was a situation where, at the time still, there were no stores at all. If you wanted a loaf of bread, you go to a place with a sort of a corrugated metal thing with a hole cut out. You shove a couple of leks in there, and they shove a loaf of bread out. There are literally no stores, no restaurants, no anything. And it was a shocking experience. Well, in 92, with the help of the U.S. government, and this is an explicit help of the U.S. government, the U.S. State Department, the U.S. foreign policy entities, a person by the name of Sali Berisha was elected president in 1992. Okay, and he was elected as the anti-communist. He was a cardiologist, and he was elected to do the bidding of the U.S. essentially. But what Berisha did was unexpected, and I don't think he deserves all the credit for it, but he completely unleashed the market. There was so much pent-up energy in Albania after having been completely restricted for all of the years during the Hoxha regime, that when he opened it up, he got rid of all licensing requirements for businesses and everything. You saw things springing up everywhere. You saw a woman would buy a can of Pepsi and sit on the corner and sell you a glass of it. And then you'd come back maybe a year later and she'd have a little shop. It was an unbelievable triumph of the free market. I have never seen it anywhere I've looked in history. An amazing triumph. But the U.S., as it tends to do with its allies, started thinking twice about this whole thing. Something is not going well here, because the U.S. foreign policy establishment had the intent of dismantling Yugoslavia. That was the intent. It was a similar impulse that the Soviet Union had to bringing diverse cultures together in a sort of universalist expression of communism, communist universalism. Well, this U.S. foreign policy harnessed that same thing in reverse, which is to split these constructs together using these different cultures and sectarian values against each other. And so by 1997, it became clear that Berisha was not going to go along with this. In fact, I sat in his office and he explained to me why the U.S. went against him. They wanted to use an island off of the coast of Albania as a listening post for Yugoslavia, because they were already planning Operation, what was it, in 1995, Storm, I think it was, to break up, to attack Croatia. And he said, no, I don't want to be a part of this war to my north. I've got minorities here, I've got Greece to the south, I've got Serbia. I don't want to be a part of it. Like that, the U.S. turned against him, fomented a coup. The State Department fomented a coup. It was fomented by the likes of the International Republican Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, all of these wonderful NGOs that were promoting democracy overseas. Well, they all flipped on a dime, and they all supported the coup, which I think killed probably 1,500 to 2,000 people in a very small country, and it put people against each other, neighbors against each other. And it's just an example of how U.S. foreign policy is always wrong, and it's always war. No matter if it's bombs dropping or if it's assassins or drones, it still is war. So in the same essay, and I'll get to my main point in a second, but in the same essay, Tom Luongo wrote, "You can't fix what's wrong with America until you fix the foreign policy." And so that's a problem. I think that's a good statement, and I agree with that. But I think this is our conundrum today as libertarians, and particularly if we are politically minded as members of the Mises Caucus, which I would hope has an aspiration for political success in the party as a whole. So if foreign policy is just war by other means, and as libertarians we are anti-war by definition, certainly anti-aggression, then how do we look at foreign policy? How do we fix foreign policy? And the radical suggestion that I'll make, and I'll make it more completely later, is that we reject the idea of foreign policy as such. And it is a radical departure. And let me go back a little bit to how I think foreign policy is tricky in libertarian circles. And unlike Maj Touré, there will be people in here who probably disagree with me on this, but I see the libertarian approach to foreign policy as mainly consisting of three factions. I think what I would call the Trotskyist faction is out there, and I don't know if people still think about him, but back when I was fighting these fights, I remember Tom Palmer is someone I would view as a Trotskyist when it comes to foreign policy. Certainly there are people in other Beltway think tanks, which I won't name at present. There are good people in those as well. But they believe that there's a worldwide ideological liberation revolution, that freedom in the U.S., liberty in the U.S. is no more important than liberty in Nicaragua or what have you, whatever. So it's all equal. This was what Trotsky preached as well. You have that faction, militant, you'd almost say neocon, because Trotskyists are neocons, a militant neocon faction of libertarianism. We're going to tell you how to set your country up, and we're going to do it good and hard, and you better like it. Then there's I call it the messianic liberal universalist faction. And it's sort of a lighter version that doesn't put equality on exporting the revolution equally with the U.S. It would say that we have an obligation as enlightened people to spread the libertarian message overseas, of course using the force of government. And then we would have what I consider the live and let live faction of view of libertarian foreign policy. And that would be someone like, I would say, for an example, Nicholas Taleb, who spoke at one of our Ron Paul Institute conferences. I think it was in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. And I think this captures what I view as the superior of these three factions. The live and let live mentality is that you can have a conservative, you can have a libertarian foreign policy, and you can devolve down to even having communism at a local level, with a small group. So the idea that there is one sort of universalist view of what's right is mistaken. And you'll see this a lot, and this is a sentiment expressed. I love democracy and freedom so much, I think we have an obligation to spread it, to expand it, to send it overseas. But what does that mean in reality? We wish people well. Certainly people are doing badly in some other countries. We wish them well, but what does it mean to spread it? Well, when you really operationalize that emotion, it means the use of state power, of U.S. state power, whether it's soft or hard. Not 100%, and I can see some people would disagree with that. Not 100%, but there certainly is the implication of the use of force from the state to tell other people how to live. And we say, some factions will say, well, if we just do it for the right reasons, it's okay. And that gets back to the beginning. It's not for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, it's that we shouldn't do it. And there's a moral counter-argument to this sort of messianic view of our purpose in the world. And that is, how can you tell other people what to do? What gives you the right? What gives us, this may be radical, what gives us the right to tell the Iranians they can't have a theocratic state if they wish? Now, we may want to open our doors to those who are not happy living in that, and they may want to immigrate to the U.S. We might be more open to immigration from people who don't want to live under that system. But what gives us the moral right, particularly as Americans who are notorious for not traveling and understanding foreign cultures, to tell other people how they should live. And now there are two ways of looking at that as well, because there's a revolutionary and an evolutionary response to that. There may be an evolutionary response in somewhere like Iran to espouse different economic and political systems. But the problem comes with the the revolutionary expression of this. And I would say this is the second. This is the practical counter-argument to the idea that we should spread freedom overseas, which is that it doesn't bloody work. It has never worked. There's never an example of the U.S. government getting involved to liberate a country and having that country turn out remotely better than before, which is the reason for that is that that's not what the U.S. government is in the business of doing. That's not the purpose of U.S. foreign policy. It is not to liberate, it's not to spread freedom, it's not to spread democracy. And if we've ingested those ideas, we need to take a purgative and get it out of our systems. The U.S. has proven to be, I think, the single worst country on earth, the worst entity on earth to bring freedom and democracy to anyone. And here's an example, taking off on something that the professor talked about, parallel structures. And I think it's a great idea, and I think it's a great suggestion. I think we are doing that. I think we're doing our best at doing that. Certainly with the Ron Paul Liberty Report, we're trying to create parallel structures at the mercy of the, what do we call it, the digital gulag, yeah. But this is what the U.S., exactly what the U.S. tried to do late Soviet period with the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy in the mid-'80s. They sought to create parallel structures of their own. They sold it as we are going to help the oppressed people of the Soviet Union find their freedom, of the Soviet bloc find their freedom. They created the Centers for Pluralism, the National Endowment for Democracy. It was fake from the beginning. It was all fake from the beginning. It was all created by the CIA not to create genuinely free organizations, but to harness dissidents into doing the bidding of the United States. So the U.S. is terrible at doing this. And we could go throughout history. We can go back before this. We can talk about Europe right after post-World War II and Greece. But we can probably pin the date. And now we're talking about the CIA, but don't forget that the State Department and the organs of foreign policy are hand in foot with the CIA. And of course, a lot of the so-called nonprofits are also hand in foot with the CIA. Certainly the Soros world has never supported a government overseas that the U.S. opposed, and vice versa. But Iran, 1953, of course, we're living with that. Guatemala, 54, we're living with that. And more recently, we see plenty of recent examples of that. We know that foreign policy greases the skids for war. It's the intelligence preparation of the battlefield, as they say in the military. And that's what foreign policy does. And for example, under Hillary Clinton, it actually weaponized our so-called diplomacy. And you can look at, for example, the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring didn't happen as it's been reported. The State Department had trained activists for years in how to foment discontent in their countries, and how to set off color revolutions. They had it. The U.S. again has this messianic insanity that somehow they can put everything in a blender and it'll come out smelling wonderful. The idea that you could set the Arab world on fire and everything would settle down into a democracy, I think would go down in history as one of the stupidest things anyone's ever come up with. But leave it to the people in our bureaucracy, who of course are in a bubble, to think stupidly, because they don't allow any counter arguments. They're not going to call any of us up and say, hey, does this sound like a good idea? No, it doesn't. It sounds pretty dumb. So here's what they did. The Arab Spring in Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Belarus. They tried in Belarus. They haven't been successful yet in Belarus. In fact, I was just reading this morning about Republika Srpska. We don't think about that often. It's shocking that we don't, but we don't. But if you remember the Dayton Accords back in the mid-'90s, they created a high commissioner for the UN to oversee Republika Srpska forever. And of course, the force behind that is the U.S. government, is the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And now they're a little upset because the Serbs in Republika Srpska, in the broader Bosnia-Herzegovina, are getting a little bit uppity, and they're pushing a little bit too much. And so they're talking about a U.S. coup there. So it never, ever ends. It never ends. U.S. foreign policy as war by other means. And so the second part and I'm trying to get us an early lunch, but the second part, I just hope I've established sufficiently the incompetence, the inability of foreign policy to do anything but problems. But what is to be done is something we always have to answer. And I'm going to go over a couple of things. Now, there are movements, many of them in the Beltway, that have libertarian sprinkles on them. And they're nice. It's like a nice donut. It looks good. And I'm referring to Responsible Statecraft, Quincy, that's the merger of Soros and Koch. Realism and Restraint as a slogan, I think, of the American Conservative. And I have written very negatively about these organizations in the past, and I've somewhat reformed my opinion. Maybe I'm in my older age, I'm getting less vicious. But I think there actually are people with good intentions, for the most part, that are in these organizations. I don't think they're a threat to us. I think they have a goal that's very different than what ours should be. Now, their goal, as I understand it now a little bit more clearly, is to seek to persuade the existing system, foreign policy system, and its elites particularly, to be a bit more moderate, to moderate the aggressive foreign policy. Usually they take a realist perspective, which is that this intervention is not in our national interest, therefore we shouldn't do it. This one, maybe we'll put it aside. This one is not. This one is. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to take the Beltway as it is, which is a sewer. And they're trying to reform it, and they're trying to get a few people to change their minds. And that's not a futile goal. And certainly when I was working in Dr. Paul's office, that's one of the things we tried to do. Dr. Paul decided to start having Thursday lunches with members of Congress. They were all Republicans, and we brought in conservative speakers who they would be comfortable with to talk to them about maybe this Iraq war is not going that great. Maybe we should rethink some things. So there's something to be said from trying to deal with people who are in power and positions. But I don't think that's our goal. And by our, I mean all of us of like minds, whether you're politically active or not. But certainly, if I would suggest a foreign policy for the Mises caucus, if I may be so bold, our role is to educate the critical masses of America that the system is corrupt and it's a ripoff and it has to be completely trashed, not reformed. I guess on a bumper sticker it would say, go radical or go home. I think that should be our foreign policy. Demanding an end of foreign policy, as we know. Reform, I think, is a four-letter word, because here's another bumper sticker for you. Reform is a safe space for the offenders, right? Because the first thing when you get caught in some horrible 9/11, what have you, we need to set up a commission, we need to reform this process so it doesn't happen again. The CIA is very great at that. Don't know how we missed that one. We're going to have to reform the CIA. We need some money. We need the DHS. That's what we need. That's reform. It's always more government. 100,000 employees of the U.S. State Department. Think about that. 100,000 employees. And I did briefly work for the State Department. I know how it works with my limited experience on the inside. What do you think these 100,000 people do every day? And I'm not trying to personalize or demonize, because I'm sure there are plenty of fine people in there. There are plenty of fine cogs in the wheel. But what do you think they do from our perspective? What do you think they do that promotes what we want? Zero. Nothing. What do they do at the embassies all day? They think up ways of messing things up. How many hundreds of people do you think are employed right now in the State Department simply working on sanctions on Iran, simply working to keep Iran under our thumb, under our boot? So if we oppose sanctions, and I think certainly all libertarians should oppose sanctions because they are acts of war, why would we want to have a State Department whose role is to have hundreds of people working on, here's a good idea, we can tell China that they shouldn't buy Iranian oil because we've got sanctions. Oh no, here's a better one. We can arrest a Chinese executive because her company was breaking our sanctions on Iran, right? This is the stuff they think up. So What do they do there? They leverage U.S. power to pressure foreign governments to do the bidding of U.S. elites. We don't want any of that stuff. We don't want them to do that stuff. They don't do anything we want. China shipping lanes. Oh, we gotta keep a good eye on that. What are they gonna do? We buy their stuff. They're gonna shut it down? Russian aggression. Yeah, we hear that. We hear a lot about that. How does that help us? Oh, we gotta keep an eye on those Afghan Islamists. Well, how did that start and how's that going? The U.S. government, our foreign policy solely serves as muscle for well-connected elites. You talk about shipping lanes. If there's a problem with shipping lanes and you're running a company, hire security. If there's a problem with pirates, hire security. Why is it our job to do this? Why is it the job of U.S. foreign policy to do the bidding of elites? They don't do anything that benefits any of us. Does anyone think they actually promote freedom or liberty? So what is to be done? Dismantle the State Department, USAID, all the subsidized NGOs, NED, etc. Cut state personnel by at least 90%. It can't be reformed. As past president of the John Birch Society said, you can't reform cancer, right? So this is what we can do. We can afford to do that because we should be a radical party. We can't be, well, on the one hand, we should probably not. No, it doesn't work. We've already got 2 or 3 of these. So take a radical view of dismantling foreign policy as we know it. It's hopelessly corrupt, but the secret is that's the good part of it. Because if they weren't so corrupt, they'd actually be a lot worse than they are, right? Things would be a lot worse because all the crap that they start would end up a lot worse off. What else can we do? And I've talked about this before. Don't be a regime change mouthpiece, right? When you hear the regime and all of the minions of the regime, and I mean all the mainstream media and a lot of the alternative media start talking about, Assad, he's a monster. But we shouldn't invade him. I'm a libertarian, Oh, he gasses his own people. Everything that you repeat that the media has reported. Oh, but I'm a good libertarian. We shouldn't invade. We shouldn't do that. Because when you do something like that, of course, the mainstream media loves that. Well, see, even the libertarians agree that the guy's a monster. Yeah, they don't want to invade him, but that doesn't matter. See, even they agree. Even libertarians agree that the guy's a monster. And this is value neutral. Maybe he is a monster. I mean, I think, as libertarians, we think all people that aspire to power, with very few exceptions, are monsters. But I think our default should always be they are lying, no matter what you see about Leader X, who the CIA, the State Department, or do I repeat myself, want to get rid of. You have to assume as your default, they are lying, they are liars. And why? Because they always lie. They have never told the truth about any regime they've wanted to overthrow, about any bad guy. Gaddafi, he's passing out Viagra. He's getting his troops. Oh my God. We've got to stop this. And of course, the NGOs, the Libya Human Rights Foundation, they were all for it. They were part of the UN, passing on the lies, getting resolutions passed. And at the end, a good friend of mine, Julian Teal, made a movie where he interviewed the head of the Libyan Human Rights Foundation, who basically started the whole ball rolling. There's not enough time to go into this. And they said, well, where did you get all these statistics about the people that Gaddafi was mowing down? He said, well, we made it up. And he actually became, when the regime was changed, he became Libya's ambassador to Switzerland. So there's a good payoff, right? I wouldn't mind that, actually, even as an anti-statist. Oh yeah, Saddam, remember that? Oh, you guys are too young for that. He was he was bayoneting babies and throwing them out of the incubators. You know the whole story. He's a monster. He's a monster. Well, he was partly because the CIA made him a monster because when they wanted him to kill a couple million Iranians. But of course, that was all a lie, as we know. It was all cooked up by another part of this da-da-da-da-da complex, and that was the PR aspect of it. We know that Hill and Knowlton was hired by the people who wanted, by the Kuwaitis who wanted the U.S. to go in and do their fighting for them. And we know that the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador was testifying before Tom Lantos in the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress, and the whole thing that she said was an absolute lie that came out later, and there was no repercussions except there were plenty of dead bodies, and those dead bodies continued to pile up from that initial invasion in 1990 until today, literally today. 1 million people, at least, that have been killed by U.S. intervention in Iraq alone. Assad is gassing his own people. And what does Trump do? I gotta hit him, right? No thought. Do it. And then what do? Oh my gosh, that was totally a lie. We lied again. Well, just suppress it. It's still being suppressed by the OPCW, completely suppressed, the Organization for the Chemical Weapons Watchdog. That guy was ISIS-K. No, dude, you just killed his whole family. He wasn't ISIS-K. Well, you lied about it for a week, at least until the correction, as always, is in the 20th paragraph in a very small print. It was a guy with his 10 kids, his family, as we know, tragically in Afghanistan a few weeks ago. And I don't mean to make light of it because I think it's disgusting. So the next time they tell you that the foreign leader X is a monster, what about the only guy that killed a family like this and lied about it until we all found out? What about successive presidents have killed 1 million people in Iraq and many more across the broader Middle East? What about a 20-year reign of U.S. terror in Afghanistan? We know about casualties. We know about the country being completely destroyed. And we try to talk about this sometimes on the Liberty Report, but think about something that you don't think about as often, because we don't have to deal, thankfully, with terrorism in the U.S., except if you're the January 6th guys, right? That was an insurrection, right? That was worse than 9/11 and the Civil War combined. Aside from that, because we're still recovering from that ourselves, but think about 20 years of not knowing if one of the bombs is going to land on your house. You know, I get afraid when there's a bad storm. I'm from Texas. I get afraid when there's a bad storm. Imagine 20 years of not knowing, whether on purpose or by accident, it's going to blow your house up. That's terrorism. That's terrorism. The U.S. foreign policy is a terrorist foreign policy. And we have to digest that. And that doesn't make us unpatriotic. In fact, I think it makes us super patriotic, because we realize these guys are doing stuff in our name that's terrible, terrible stuff. And that makes us look bad. And that makes us, people hate us. It doesn't mean they're going to invade us, but it's still a pretty crappy thing to do, right? Ultimately. So, the president of peace, right? They're always elected as the peace president. Obama was a peace president after the imbecile George W. Bush, right? And he certainly played the role. And then he discovered that, hey, I can just drone people, and it doesn't look as bad. No Americans are killed, so no American's going to give a damn about it, right? The media's certainly not going to report it. So let's drone a few Americans too. It doesn't matter. Nobody's going to know. Who cares? So, you know, when you talk about forces for evil in the world, I would say, yeah, you can talk about the military, you can talk about the CIA, you can talk about all this stuff. But the enabler, to use a pop psychology term, the enabler is always foreign policy. That's how they get the ball rolling. So again, I would say we have to think about radically reforming, I said the word, radically opposing foreign policy as such. Does that mean we have no embassies and we're isolationists? Well, that wouldn't be a bad thing. Raimondo always loved it when they called them isolationists. He said, yeah, okay, and what? And what's the problem? No, I don't think that would be, but certainly in the digital age, do we need to have an embassy in country X with 300 people and 40 Marines? And, you know, I mean, the only thing, I lived in Hungary for a long time, and the only thing the U.S. Embassy did there that was of any use whatsoever, and it was good. It was a great idea. And in fact, I would support if they wanted to do something like this. The U.S. Information Service, which I don't think exists anymore, they had an American library inside the embassy. It wasn't inside the compound, but it was an annex to the compound. And it was filled with really great books by great American authors. And in fact, it's where I started devouring Mencken. So they had a lot of great stuff and a broad view of things. That's how you introduce people to American culture and our policies and how about having some Henry Hazlitt books in the libraries everywhere? How about Mises and Rothbard and all the other stuff, literature? That is something that can be done. So I'm not saying shut everything down and shut the doors. You could auction off a lot of properties, though. So in the end, I would say, you might sort of think about this and all this negativity and say, so hang on. Aren't we the good guys? And my answer would be, hey, who's this we, right? So thank you very much.
I'll let I'll let our little marketplace here decide, because I know you spoke about wanting to have an early lunch. If you're up for it, do you guys want to do Q&A or do you want to go to lunch? Do we have to do a roll call? Do we have to break out Roberts? Let's see, hands up for Q&A.
You can split the difference and do a one question or two questions.
Yeah, let's do that. How about, we'll do 2 questions. All right, so raise hands again. Who's getting the mic first? Boom. Oh, you got them. And who's getting it second? Who's getting the mic for the second question? All right, we'll do one.
Okay, so my question is, you were talking about how the U.S. foreign policy was a war and that I think you said that we never did anything good with it. Like, would you say that is true for even our interventions in World War I and II? Because I feel like...
Yeah, but it's the question of instead of what, they probably would have been better off without, the millions, 50, 60 million that died in both wars. And we don't know that they wouldn't have progressed along an evolutionary process that would have led them to where they are and perhaps even better. So the idea that you have to sacrifice so many people, and it's certainly well documented now. It's not even, I don't think, considered a conspiracy theory that U.S. foreign policy as such, and certainly FDR as a president, encouraged U.S. moves that would aggravate Japan and make them more likely to attack the U.S. We know things about oil embargoes and many other things. So the U.S. clearly wanted those wars. And so, again, the question is, what would have happened if we hadn't had them? We certainly wouldn't have had Nazi Germany if we hadn't had World War I. So that's a pretty good thing.
So I'm currently rereading The Creature from Jekyll Island. And would you talk a little bit about how the international banking cartel kind of supports and creates our foreign policy as it is?
Oh, that's a great question. In fact, we just had a conference.
There's a whole book on it.
Yeah. Well, we just had a great conference. I mean, great. I'm a little bit subjective here, but on the 50th anniversary of the closing of the gold window, we had it with Jim Grant out in Houston, and it was great. And our slogan was, it was the Ron Paul quote. And I'm embarrassed right now because I'm on the stage and I forget. The 20th century was a story of central banking and total war. This is essentially what it's all about. We would not have, certainly without our central bank, we would not have been able to have the wars. We could not have the foreign policy that we have right now. It would be impossible to have a foreign policy of global empire without someone pretending to print the money to do it. So if banking is absolutely critical, central banking is absolutely critical. And in my fantasy world someday, if I have some time, I would mind spinning off like an institute for the study of banking and war, because I think it's so important to look at that, talk about facilitating each other. So, and they get rich and we get poor. And the Fed. Thank you.